Welcome to the Building Doctor Show with Jens Johansson.
Okay, welcome to the Building Doctor Show. I'm your host, Jens Johansson. Glad to see you here to learn more about your buildings. Today, we're going to talk about flood insurance, big flood insurance, as opposed to water damage and rainwater or wind-driven rain, that kind of water intrusion. So we're entering October, and we're expecting some of the first big rains after dry summers. There might be some flooding from clogged drainage, clogged storm sewers, even stormwater backups. So we're helping you figure out what the difference between flood insurance is and just normal rain or water damage or leaky hot water heaters. So if you're joining and listening to us on the podcast or YouTube, thanks for listening. But be sure to visit our website at j2consultants.com to register for the Building Doctor Show and attend live via Zoom. This allows you to enter questions that you have, and it doesn't just have to be about flood insurance. And so if you have any of your board member and you have any curious questions about what do I do in this, enter it into the chat enter it into the Q&A, and we'll get that answered for you at the end of the show. Disclaimer, remember, we're not giving engineering, financial, legal advice. This is for educational content only. So let's get into it. So today's agenda, our timing couldn't be better. We put these agendas together. This one was put together 2-3 weeks ago. And just this weekend, we had a big earthquake in Russia, 8.7 on the Richter scale or magnitude scale. And that put out tsunami alerts for all of the Pacific. And, so we had this Sunday. And so we're talking about this stuff, and it's relevant. We're located in the Pacific Northwest. We also serve, Mountain West. And so we'll talk about kind of flood risks there. We're going to talk about the different types of flood coverage. I've heard there's kind of, the National Flood Program. What about private flood insurance? Which is better and what do we need? We'll talk about the claims process. That'll benefit you from either flood insurance or regular water damage insurance, and prevention and risk strategies. We've talked a lot about that in previous shows, and then some key takeaways. So flood insurance is totally different. It's a separate policy. It's like earthquake insurance. You got to buy flood insurance, and that's different than my unit flooded because my refrigerator ice maker line burst and my hardwood floors are all wet. I need water extraction, and I need fans and dehues, and it was something kind of inside my unit. It wasn't this big thing. So the differences are, we'll talk a little bit about what water damage is versus flood. So here we're using a slide straight from ServPro's website. So you notice the ground is flooded. The parking lot is flooded. The loading bays are almost getting water into them. Here's a car driving up the ramp to get out of the water. So this whole area this is a flood. So how is that different than, my toilet overflowed or my pipe burst in my unit, which caused water damage? Is much different than my unit was flooded. So we'll talk about that. So this is, again, ServPro's website here. Thank you for the pictures, ServPro. Here they're extracting water. So there's water all over their floor and hardwoods, and they're sucking up water. And so this could happen in a flood, but this typically happens in, my water tank burst and got all over my unit. So we want to think flood insurance coverage means a rising water event, like a tsunami, a river overflow, a dam burst, and it's related to you living in a flood zone or a flood plain, or maybe on the coast, things like that. Here's the levee broke in New Orleans, right? So this is a big flood barrier, and it broke, and New Orleans is underwater. Here is a site. It could be a site drain. It could also be a utility pipe. It's the cap over that, and water is clearly coming up from that. So the sewer city backed up, and maybe it flooded my basement. Another way to talk about floods is feeding groundwater. It's pouring down rain. We see some of that, but hey, maybe the creek overflowed or just there was so much rain. We talk about rain in inches per hour. And the code gives us, depending on where we live, 4 inches per hour is a pretty good storm. But we have some of these others, it's just we call it gully washer. So that's just all the water flowing down the gully. And so when it rains in drier areas or, Utah or Texas, they get X amount of rain per year, but it happens in 2 days. And so they get inches of rain. And so that's site water, that's storm surge, that's kind of runoff. So that's flood insurance. So, kind of some things to think about. Flooding is bigger than you or your property. Think of it like Mother Nature, something big broke or backed up. Water loss or water damage is something inside your unit broke, or maybe your resident above you, something broke and water intrusion is damaging your unit. Other thing with coastal properties is, we have this nice property on the beach and we have a small beach retaining wall. And most of the time, the tide, it goes up and down and it's still behind the retaining wall. But every year, the highest tide of the year is called the king tide. And so that king tide is way up top of that, right at that top of the, breakwater. What if there's a storm on a king tide day? So two things align, wind and storm and, just waves, and the tide is already the highest point. Then that floods, so then we talk about sandbags and first floor units getting kind of invaded with what? They're invaded with salt water or invaded with, this river type stuff. So it's not rainwater, kind of the perfect storm. All right. So here we get into causes, and I'll break down why we're talking about this. So cause, the high winds ripped off my roof shingles, which allowed rain intrusion, which flooded or water damaged my house. In this case, the storm or wind damage was the cause, and most policies will cover this. These are your typical property insurance policies. Is rain, wind-driven rain, storm event, clearly indicated to high winds that damaged something, water got in. Now, the old drippy leaky water heater finally gave out, flooded my unit. Why is that not going to be covered? So it's old, drippy, leaky. Okay. So most insurance policies have something about continuous seepage, continuous leaking and seepage over time, seepage over 14 days. And so I've got this old water here. It's rusty. There's a little water on the floor, but all of a sudden tomorrow it just gives way. And so that stuff usually isn't covered. So this is why we have something old and decrepit that needs to be replaced. The insurance company says you should have replaced it. Or with the plumbing repair, the old cast iron pipes finally gave way and rusted water, or the new PEX plastic pipes had some problem or defect with them and gave way, whoosh, big leak. Those types of things, the old drippy things are not covered. The sudden and accidental leaks, it was instant, it was sudden. Those things are covered, usually under your policy. So this other box here, a fire sprinkler pipe, those sprinklers up in the ceiling, broke on the 17th floor and caused water damage, flooding of all the units below. So this was because this was the fire sprinkler's fault and not flood damage, not tsunami damage. This was, you blame the fire sprinkler sub or some type of issue there. Usually covered under most policies, but again, we kind of get into this, who's responsible? Was the fire sprinkler sub just working on it and he's supposed to let his glue dry for an hour, but he was in a hurry, let it dry for half an hour, turned the pressure back on, and the glue failed and the thing blew all over. Okay, the fourth one, that rooftop swimming pool that everybody loves, cracked and flooded the unit below. So I laid some dots after that as, okay, was it a sudden and accidental thing? Was it an earthquake that we've seen these pictures lately of these swimming pools and rocking and waving around? If the earthquake caused the swimming pool to flood, that would be the earthquake insurance policy I needed. Or was it sudden and accidental? Okay, then my master policy would cover it. Or was it kind of an old leaky swimming pool that had been dripping over time? Now we get into that 14-day seepage. So this is, and I'm kind of being vague because most typically covered or maybe covered, leaving some dots after it. It's important to have a good insurance policy and understand what's covered, what isn't, and kind of take it through these steps. And that's when you're talking to your insurance broker about that, of what happens if the tide comes in. Well, you live on a floodplain, and so you need flood insurance in addition to your master policy. What happens if this breaks? Well, that's covered by your master policy. So you can run through these scenarios with your broker. Let's see. Yep, talked about that. Okay, so here's some causes, definitions, and tricky scenarios. Back to when we're trying to determine if things are covered or not. So poorly installed windows, leaking, causing water damage to the exterior walls, windows. A lot of times that's covered. Deck or roof membrane leaks. Here's some deck with some siding pulled off, and we can see the water damage there. This is again rain or runoff causing water damage to my ceiling, deck, or roof. Okay, so let's talk about this. Over on the left or on the right, these ugly looking windows, and they're even deteriorated, and they even have some trim popping off. So this is obvious. This is obvious water damage, probably requires maintenance, or definitely requires maintenance, if not replacement. Then we get into over here, we've actually had to peel some things off to find this damage. So we get into what's called, a couple of legal terms, latent and patent. So latent means hidden, patent means totally exposed. And one way I remember that easily is patent is spelled the exact same way as patent. What does patent mean? Here's my manufacturing process. I'm going to publish it to the world. You can't copy it. I have patent protection, right? So it's very, very clear. So in this photo, back to these old windows, it's very clear that this is pretty damaged. So this is patent. Latent, this deck is hidden water damage. I had to peel siding off. My deck coating looked great, but for whatever reason, water was getting in through bad flashings or whatnot. And it wasn't until I peeled off the fascia and the deck that I saw this. And so latent, hidden, patent, not. So in previous episodes, we've been talking about insurance companies coming out and wanting to inspect your building before they issue a new policy or before they renew your policy. They're going to walk around and look for this. They're going to say, I'm not putting an insurance policy on that. That is patent damage. I don't want to be liable for wind-driven rain claims, things like that. And so they're saying, we're not renewing you until you fix this. So that's kind of where we're getting into water damage technicalities. And then we'll really move into flood. So, all right. So now we kind of get into some couple more situations that we've seen. So flood insurance is different. So it's a standalone policy. Don't say my unit flooded to the adjuster. It's a keyword that pops up in their head and they go, oh, we have flood denial. We have flood exclusion. So I'm going to be lazy and just deny your claim. You said it was a flood. Now, did water from an interior source or whatever, did something just happen, sudden accident? I actually have water damage and I need water extraction and fans and dehues, come out and inspect, that type of stuff. And so here's where that played out. So we have a employee that lives in North Carolina in their hurricanes last year. So big storm, big hurricane, North Carolina mountains. So the rain from the hurricane caused mudslides, which slid down the hill, dammed up the river. Then the river overflows because it has a mudslide dam in it. The river overflows and floods some houses. So we've got houses alongside the river. Maybe they're in a floodplain. But what about the houses uphill? Clearly not in the floodplain. So we've got, well, we're denying your claim because it was a flood. And so we have to kind of backtrack. Well, if it wasn't for the hurricane, which is a typically covered thing under my master policy, I wouldn't have this landslide and I wouldn't have the flooding if the landslide didn't flood the river. And so I think rain caused all the sequence of events, and you're denying my flood claim because flood is not covered. But then even houses up the hill were being denied. Well, this is part of the flood. Well, I'm not even in the floodplain by the river, and the mudslide damaged my house or knocked trees down. Well, it was part of a big flood event. And so you can see where these words get tied up and misconstrued, and things tend to not happen well. So be very, I just want to drive home the point. I think we plowed that field enough, but be very clear. Was it a flood or was it a pipe burst? And I just need water extraction. My unit may have flooded in either scenario, but I need some cleanup. Okay. So the myth, my homeowner's condo insurance covers flood damage. Nope. Two different policies. Think of flood insurance like earthquake insurance, it's a separate policy. So standard property insurance specifically excludes flood damage and the related coverage. So obviously they can be expensive, but there are other contributing factors. So like the hurricane, like the mudslide, like the, or the high winds blew my shingles off, then the water came in. So what is the sequence of events here? But if you say, hey, my unit's flooded, well, they might believe you and they might deny based on you don't have flood coverage. So understand those differences. Okay, so again, a table comparing the two. Standard property insurance covers burst pipes in the walls, water heater explosions, appliance failures, roof leaks, ice dams, wind-driven rain. Standard property policies do not cover, most water that starts outside the building and comes in, except rain and wind-driven rain. Sewer backups. And sometimes we require separate coverage there because it's a utility, but flood insurance covers that usually. Surface water runoff, and again, this is just a sheeting of water that you see running across the surface. Groundwater seepage that's bubbling up, or it's just a high water table and it's flooding your basement. It's really not on the surface, but I know it's right there. And then this storm surge or this river flooding thing we've talked about. So tsunami, storm surge, or river overflowing its banks. Again, think big outside. Remember that picture we saw of the entire parking lot? The whole neighborhood is flooded. That is where flood insurance is needed. And master policy flood coverage, unit owner, individual flood coverage. So when we have this flood insurance, especially in a condo, you have your master policy, and then do you have an additional interior policy like your HO6 that's part of your standard stuff that insures your contents? So again, we need your contents are insured from fire, tree strike, and things like that under your normal policy. Yet a flood, would they pay for your couch? Would they pay for that stuff? So master policy, you got to make sure about elevators. That's a big deal because elevator with a hydraulic or a pit system, so as you can imagine, the salt water from the ocean comes in, sits in that pit, all the salt rusts the hydraulics and destroys everything. And elevators are expensive. And so all your stuff that's usually in your parking garage or kind of your below grade situation, your mechanical, your boilers, your electrical equipment, your all these, rooms or utility rooms are kind of tucked down in the basement for some reason. These things might have a problem. Now, on your master policy, you can also get some temporary housing for all residents. You can kind of, because it's kind of business operation, right? I'm in the business of having a condo which has units. The master policy can have a housing allowance, or the individual policy can do this. Individual policies obviously are personal property, interior improvements, additional living expenses, ALE. ALE. That means hotels, food, a trip to Walmart to get some clothes because everything was destroyed. So those are all ALE items. And then Some of them have, if anything's not covered by the master, we'll cover it. Or if it is covered by the, so they start blaming policies or crossing policies again, right? So this is another one of these. I have flood insurance, but it doesn't cover that, or it does cover that, or you're supposed to get this in addition to us getting that. Another thing to pay attention to is business interruption claims. If you run a rental property, I don't live in the condo, but I rent it out. Do you have business loss interruption or something that pays for my tenant is displaced? I got to do all these repairs. So that's part of a normal fire policy. You'll see that in a normal fire property insurance policy, that they will pay your rent and do those things, and that way you can keep your investment moving. And there we go. Now, 30-day waiting period rule. You can't buy the day before the storm, and you can't buy the day of the storm. There's usually a waiting period unless you just bought it, or policy updates or renewals or things like that. So plan ahead for these seasonal risks. So when you buy flood insurance through the National Flood Insurance Program, that's the think FEMA or NFIP, coverage doesn't start right away. They have this 30-day waiting period. Similarly, you can't buy wildfire insurance when the hillside's burning, that kind of thing. And so if there's a storm forecast, you can't buy it right before the storm. So, but again, let's see, loan requirements and things like that. Map changes. So we have these things called floodplains. You can Google your property and say, am I in a floodplain or am I in a flood zone? And so FEMA updates these things consistently. Some days they're changing the lines for whatever reasons. And I'll talk a little bit about that. So if they've changed the lines, you got to buy now, or they've reduced that, you can get rid of your policy, whatever. So 30-day waiting period. In the Pacific Northwest, hey, we've got November through March, we have heavy rainfalls, we've got snow melt. In the coastal conditions, we've got the king tide we talked about, or storm surge, sunny day flooding in low-lying coastal communities, and then urban flooding, aging storm drain systems. Okay, so I don't know if you've been through other countries in high rain, their storm system isn't set up for it, and why are the streets flooding? This is weird. And so a lot of that is sewage. Flash flooding, things to think about there. Mountain West. Wildfire. So we have wildfires are a big deal on the West Coast right now, and they're burning at the end of summer. We see flooding after a fire for like 3 to 5 years. The burned areas don't have any vegetation that drink the water, right? And B, the soil gets baked. In these real hot ones, the soil can just get baked like a clay. And so the water just runs right off it. So we've got more risk for mudslides and things like that. You've got more risk of snow melt, ice dams, ice jams. I'm going to jam with that ice dam. So the ice dams are when icicle, you see all these beautiful icicles and say, hey, isn't that great? Well, that's because your heat in your unit is coming out, melting the snow. It's converting to an ice dam, and snow and ice and water don't flow off the roof. So it backs up under your shingles. And again, flash flooding and things like that. All right. So let's see. National Flood Insurance Program. So this is the government program grade. One size fits all. They spread the money around. And the big risk there is, remember last year when FEMA ran out of money? And so I thought I had FEMA coverage. I thought I had National Flood Insurance Program. So it's all right. And so here's the coverage limits. So up to $250,000 for condo associations. All right. If that tidal wave came in, what would it damage? Contents coverage up to $100,000 per building. So I've got a lot of first floor units. I've got to split up this 100,000. So here's what I'm saying. It's kind of one size fits all, and here's some limits. They don't have any coverage for temporary living expenses, replacement costs versus actual cash value limitations. They've replacement cost versus actual cost. And then some things it doesn't cover. So swimming pools, fences, landscaping, those are all damaged by a flood, right? But they're kind of designed to keep, let you have shelter, keep you in your home. We don't care about your swimming pool because again, we have that limited pool, and we need to cover as many people's houses. I don't care about your pool and your landscaping, your fences, because I want to take care of people's houses. Any kind of property outside the building, financial losses due to business interruption, additional living expenses. So you can see where private insurance maybe is a better option for you. So advantages: higher coverage limits, replacement cost value, additional living expenses, broader coverage, faster claims processing. I haven't had to file a claim with the National Flood Insurance Program, but I imagine it's like talking to the IRS. We'll get around to it eventually. So considerations: usually more expensive. Coverage varies significantly between companies. And here's where them understanding condos versus single family homes. And it may not be available, but it's usually more available, and that's why it's private. So the federal program is going to be working off the floodplains and the zones, and then you're just going to say you're in this, you have to buy that, or basically your bank says that for your mortgage. But there might be some ones that are not in a floodplain, but I am on a different piece of ground that doesn't drain well, or I'm worried about this, or I'm next to a stream, so I want to buy some additional flood coverage. So just letting you know, there's the government program and there's private programs. Private programs cover more, usually a little bit more expensive, but can be specific or tailored to what you have. Special considerations for condos, determine proper coverage amounts for shared facilities. So who pays for the clubhouse? Who pays for the common areas? Remember, these common areas are outside your unit. So the national program is just your unit. It's not the common area. We want to make sure we got that pickleball court going. But you're also coordinating between the master policy and then the individual unit coverages. So just kind of get somebody to break all that down for you. And then, hey, special assessments when the insurance falls short. So remember, the national insurance program had 250,000. Well, if you're 500,000 per unit, you're going to be 250,000 per unit short. So you'll be doing special assessments or loans or whatever. And then loss assessment coverage for unit owners. And so that's more contents. That's all that, figuring it out. Understanding the flood zone maps. And here's where you can Google it. So the FEMA flood map. So they have these zones: AE, high flood risk; VE, we can kind of go down these things. A, coastal, you can read that. So look up your property's flood zone, and then understand, they give some terminology about 500-year flood. That doesn't mean it happens every 500 years. That just means it's this magnitude, or 100-year flood, or 500 years. So it'll happen, and when it does, it'll be a problem. So they'll have these gradients, and that's why they've defined out these zones. And of course, if you're in the highest risk, you're going to pay the most. And then beyond the official map, so climate change affects these patterns, local drainage issues not reflected in the FEMA maps. Who knows how often they've been updated. Historical flooding in your area, and this is kind of an interesting one. Historical flooding in your area and local knowledge. And so I coined it lobbyists versus farmers. I grew up in a small town, farming town. There was a big river going through it, and the farmland next to the rivers, about every 10 years it would flood, and you'd see these fields flooded. And that's bad for the farmer because his pumpkins are flooded or whatever. But about 10 years ago, we see this housing development going on in these fields. And it was like, wait a minute, they're building a bunch of houses in a place that floods. How can they do that? So then I go to the flood zone map, and guess what? The flood zone map's changed. This is no longer a flood zone. I'm like, interesting. I wonder if some lobbyists got together and bent these rules so now we can build here. But here's where local knowledge comes in, and not 100, not 500, but every 7 to 10 years, that field floods. And so I'm worried about those houses there, and I hope they've done something. Maybe they have changed the drainage issues. Maybe they have put in a dam or a dike. Who knows? And so again, pay attention to local knowledge, and that's somebody that's been here a long time. Is this normally a flood thing? Or when you're buying a new condo and kind of checking it out, is this in flood zone areas? And then of course Google it, FEMA flood map. You can Google your address. Okay, so how to determine this? They've got calculators, but replacement cost of structure is not market cost, and this is any kind of insurance policy. So if my building were to burn down under my standard property policy that I have right now, these units or this house sells for $1 million. I could probably build it for less than that, right? It's a pile of 2x4s and sheets of drywall and some things like that. So I can rebuild it for $700K. Granted, I can't buy it unless I pay $1 million. So you want replacement cost, not market value. And so you can talk to contractors. You can get a rule of thumb for 250, $300 a square foot, and that's how we determine those things. Include code upgrade requirements, especially if your property's old. So that house built in 1960s that burns down or floods or earthquakes away, I want to rebuild my house. Well, now we're rebuilding per new building codes, and we got to do this, this, and this, and this, and this. So those are called code upgrades or code requirements. So make sure you have coverage for code upgrades. And then consider those shared facilities, pools, clubhouses, things like that need to be rebuilt as well in this flood event. Personal property, individual unit owners, obviously that's a complete inventory. So what do I have? And I need insurance for it. I've got prize collections, my baseball cards, or a lot of jewelry, a lot of this, a lot of that. You figure that out. Then we talk common area contents and equipment. Hey, our rooftop deck has 50 chaise loungers, and rooftop deck won't flood. Let me talk about our patio outside has a hot tub and a bunch of chaise loungers and barbecues. So are those things included? Because the individual property policy doesn't include that. The master policy is just talking about the building unless you add on these things. And so technology and communication systems for your stuff, satellite dishes.
This podcast is part of J2's free live webinar, The Building Doctor Show. To attend the live show and ask your questions during the Q&A, visit www.j2consultants.com.